Thank you all for attending. This is really exciting. I have what should hopefully be an engaging discussion if you're a developer. Do we have people who are developers? Cool. Operators? Not as many. Okay. And just users of OpenStack Cloud, because what we've really been trying to do is define what is OpenStack. So once again, my name is Rob Hirschfeld. I work for Dell. I am a community elected board member for the OpenStack Foundation. And what I'm presenting today has really been 18 months, more like 2 years of effort for helping define what core is. It's one of the jobs the board has, and I'm the co-chair of the committee with Josh McKinty about rolling this through. And as you'll see, we're not done yet. We've still got quite a while to go to make all this stuff work. At the end, there's a call to action, and this is really, like everything else and like the title says, a community participation event. So it is very important for us to hear from you about this process. Negative, we actually incorporate a lot of feedback into these cycles, and positive. Positive allows us to move the process more quickly, and we'll get to that. So the first thing I want to clear up, OpenStack is a lot of things to a lot of people. There are 3 uses of the OpenStack mark. We're going to talk about only one. So there's community, people using the logo, print on shirts, or have meetups, or things like that. Those are managed by the foundation in very specific ways, but they're non-commercial. There's code, the actual things in GitHub, and managed by the technical committee. And commerce, which is really the board's domain. And when we talk about DefCore and what we're doing today, it's about commercial use. And that's a really important distinction, and some people miss that. It's important because at the end of the day, everybody consuming OpenStack is consuming it through some type of product. I won't say everybody. A lot of people are. And so if you're not downloading the code and building your own Python modules, you're interacting usually through some commercial venue, right? A distro or a service provider or a product itself. And that's really what we're trying to help people understand what it is. And so our goal here is to make OpenStack interoperable, right? That was the vision that started all this. It's part of why people are using it. It's great to have code that you can use to run to run a cloud. It's even more important if that code allows you to have your cloud work with somebody else's cloud. And what we've heard is very important is that OpenStack has to be reliable. It has to be tested. It has to be implementation that people can share. It's not just an API, and we'll talk about that. But, and I have and here, and don't impede growth and innovation. So we want stable, reliable, tested, validated, great, but fast. Keep innovating. We want to see a lot of excitement in the community around the edges, which gives us a challenge. So what we've done is we've put together this process. We use the word DefCore for a lot of reasons. One of them is that it Googles and hashtags very nicely. So if you want background on this process, you can look for DefCore. And besides very loud music, you will find information about this topic. And so what we've done is OpenStack products are defined by 2 important things. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the must-pass tests and designated code. And what this does is it defines how people get involved with the community and also defines the minimum standards that people can use to have a product called OpenStack. And this is really the heart of what we're trying to do. By defining these minimum standards for using the OpenStack brand, then when people use OpenStack, they have some confidence that they can move their code, they can move their automation, they can change their experience and have a base minimum experience. Okay? That doesn't mean that the universe of OpenStack is going to be lessened. This actually should allow us to continue to innovate against a known required minimum. So what does this mean? We have 2 components to this definition. One of them is capabilities. Capabilities are effectively the APIs. So we've identified 120 capabilities in the Havana release. There's even more in the future releases. And these are test-driven validations of a capability. Can I create a machine? Can I create an image? Can I attach it to a network? Those are all defined capabilities, and they're validated. So it's not just, hey, we think we should have foo as a service, but do we actually have tests that validate that it works so that we can be cross-platform? And And I know Caroline, when she speaks next, is going to talk about licenses quite a bit. And this is an interesting hybrid approach to some of our Apache. OpenStack is Apache. What we have decided to do in this definition is say, well, it's Apache, anybody can do anything with the code. But there are certain things that make OpenStack OpenStack, and we're saying that if you want to use the brand, those are required components. So we've identified that the project has capabilities API, and it has what we call designated sections of code that we expect you to use. Some projects might have none, right? A good example is Keystone has been commonly implemented with API compatibility, but especially large-scale service providers didn't implement the code, they re-implemented. That's okay for something like Keystone. For something like Nova, it's not okay. We're working to define what those sections are, and that's work we're doing right now. So what a designated code section looks like is that there are certain things, this is very logical, right? We're not trying to say you have to deploy this strange library that does esoteric things. Exactly the opposite. The purpose of designated code is so people using OpenStack, people contributing to OpenStack, understand what they have to share in Upstream and where they can innovate, change, or differentiate. And that's really what we're talking about here. And there's specific guidelines that we're hammering out on what's designated and what's not designated. The important thing to describe here is that this is an open process. This isn't a couple of people in a star chamber with sealed doors deciding you have to use this line of code and you have to use that line of code. These are general guidelines that we're putting together with community input, and they will evolve release to release to release. So part of this whole process is that we're iterating towards an interoperable definition. We're not going to have it on day one. We're not going to have it in Paris when we meet. We're working towards it, and a lot of what we want to do, and the reason why I'm here presenting this, is because we need feedback from real people using the products, really experiencing, like our last talk, experiencing frustrations with the APIs, and making sure that we continue to improve and say, this code is required, this code is giving me trouble. Okay. So I don't want to dwell too long on the history of DefCore, but I have enough time that I'll give you a little bit of background. We've been doing this for a long time, so I don't expect everybody has followed the minutia. I hope you haven't, because it's been a sort of a messy process. If you're following it, thank you. We love it. But the reality here is that we have gone through a principles-driven approach so that we can actually now sit down and give you a scorecard for the Havana release. And if you know OpenStack, you know Havana's a couple of releases old. We're doing it intentionally on older releases so that people can give us feedback and then more quickly iterate towards the current releases where the stakes are much higher. And so for Havana, it's advisory. For Icehouse, it'll actually be enforced. And then for Juno, we're really expecting to see a lot of vendor compliance and starting to change some behaviors in the community around what is the core, the commercial core of the product. And so we identified this. This was ratified by the board in Hong Kong, so 8 months ago. And what we did was we sat down and said, look, we need to know how we're going to make these decisions. Obviously, it's high stakes when you tell people this project is required, this project's not required, this code is required, this code is not required. Those end up getting people very riled up on both sides. There's a lot of vendors who don't want to be told that they have to use code that they don't think they should use, and there's a lot of people in the community who believe that their code should be required in every product, even if the vendors disagree. So this is a very contentious issue, and that's why we went back to a principles-based approach to solving this. And these principles basically tell us that core is the integrated product, and then it says, hey, we have the idea that there's a reference implementation that we expect OpenStack in the open to work as it is. And you can get these slides off of the OpenStack wiki in DefCore. And there's a lot more definition and description, and there's pages and pages of material behind this. But the expectation is OpenStack will work as a whole in the open, and vendors can substitute certain pieces of that code. And then we expected this to be validated by tests. And if you're familiar with OpenStack, we use the Tempest Tests. So right now, the Tempest suite is the default test that we want to use for validation. We left that open-ended It's a matter of practical implementation. And if you're used to Tempest, we're actively working with the Tempest team to apply Tempest, which is predominantly a dev test gate, to an implementation-based deployment. I know a lot of vendors and people in the ecosystem already use Tempest this way, and so we're really putting some emphasis on using the same test suite that the developers use for implementation testing and validation. Okay? That in itself is an amazing accomplishment, something that I'm personally proud of helping drive through in the community, that our development and implementation tests can actually be converged into the same suite. Right? So these tests can be administered by yourself or by remote, and then from those tests, we are going to choose the ones that must pass, and that comes back up to what capabilities are. So this slide doesn't include the word capabilities. Collections of tests are capabilities. So when we actually look at scoring which tests are included or not, we do it on a capability roll-up basis. It's just there's too many tests, and they're growing exponentially for us to choose individual tests. What that means is you end up with a graph like this, where OpenStack is defined. Now, once again, the commercial brand for OpenStack is defined as it passes the tests and it uses the required code. Vendors are welcome to add in additional code, additional things in if they want to. We are not talking about a purely API-compatible mark. Okay? OpenStack was founded on the principles that it is software and that there is code that is shared. There is always discussion when we talk about this that one day we might have enough test coverage and enough of a compatibility suite that we could have somebody pass the tests without implementing OpenStack. I know there's a Java implementation of OpenStack, and there's some other alternatives. I want to be very clear. Those would not be considered OpenStack in these definitions and couldn't use the trademark. In the future, we will continue to discuss that, because even though we say that very clearly, it is definitely one of the things that people always ask about. Well, if I pass the tests, aren't I OpenStack? Not under this definition, no. And that's very important to us as a community, because upstreaming and collaboration within the project base is a really important thing, right? It's part of what makes OpenStack the project that it is. It's part of what drives the commercial vendors to continue collaborating. And it allows us to continue to advance the code base and make sure that there is an open variant of OpenStack. And then on the other side of it, if you can't pass the tests, you're misconfigured. If you can't pass the test and don't use the code, you're a yak. Doesn't make any difference to us. And so the next logical question is, how do we take all of this work, right? There's thousands of tests. There are 1,200 tests in Havana. There's 2,500 tests in Icehouse. I expect with the pressure we're putting on vendors to use tests to evaluate the product, that we're going to continue to see acceleration of test development. I'm going to pause and repeat that. We're going to continue to see acceleration of test development because we've created a commercial benefit to vendors to create tests. Okay? That was an intended consequence of this whole program. So what we're showing here is there's 12 criteria. When it comes down to scoring these capabilities, they can get very contentious, right? Swift, our object store, is one of the classic places where there's a lot of argument in the community, and I get pulled over in events like this by one person who says object storage isn't part of an IaaS infrastructure, and another person who comes up to me 5 minutes later and says it has to be part. Object storage is essential. And they're both valid points of view. What we're trying to do is have a way to make those discussions based on more objective criteria than whether or not you've pulled a board member over and talked to them last. And so what we did was we defined 12. We actually started with 13 criteria. We came down to 12. They break into 4 major categories. Once again, there's a wiki page that goes into this in great detail, and there's rationale for a lot of these, but they break into 4 categories. Usage. So we want our APIs to show that they're in use. We want to make sure that it aligns with our technical direction, so the APIs are relevant to our ongoing success, that they play well with others. So part of this is OpenStack easy to use? We actually have criteria that say, are you discoverable? Are you documented? Have you been used in the past? Right? We don't want to yank the rug out from under people. So that's an important criteria for this. And then we also wanted a system view. So we want to take OpenStack, and we don't want to say, hey, this is a great thing. We all want to have the new version of Neutron. We want to jump to it really quick. Great. But if none of the other projects implement it yet, it doesn't necessarily benefit the criteria as a whole. So it's very important for us when we look at defining core that we don't look at it project by project, but that we also look at it as an overall system, because that's how people consume OpenStack. Okay. So it's important to lay through this so that you understand how we're making these decisions and what's going on behind it. And the reason why this is really important to everybody in the room, even if you're not writing the code or a vendor making a product, is because this is where we start getting feedback. This is where we start collecting information, and we actually need to have the community weigh in and say, this is what matters. Right now, we use equal weighting on all these criteria. I would hope in the future that we're going to prioritize use, and we're actually building collection infrastructures to help do this, where it's what APIs and projects and capabilities are most being used in the community are the ones that we should show the highest weight towards. And that means that if there's a new project that's getting a lot of use, that might be on a faster path to become a core capability than a project that, while maybe older, is actually showing decreased use. And that allows us to then deprecate. Once again, this is a release-by-release evolution. And so this is just a specific group. So, for example, in a capability, you might have something called block snapshots, and then it relinks back to a specific set of tests. So part of what we're doing is, while capabilities can be fuzzy, block snapshots, and we're working to create more human, meaningful names on these and descriptions. We're working with the PTLs for this. You can still go back and point to lines of code that are actually tested and what the tests are that run that capability. And this allows us to be very specific in how it goes. And for the community, the users, the vendors to point out gaps. Because there are gaps. There are a lot of holes in the test matrix. There's places where we need better coverage. There's configurations that aren't well addressed. And so from that perspective, it is very important for the community to come in and say, hey, this capability is important to me, and I don't think it's tested well enough. You can contribute tests, or you can talk to your vendors and help get the test coverage up. As the test coverage grows, the interoperability of OpenStack is going to also increase. And one of the things that's important to note here is our expectation is not that the vendors are doing all the certification, but that the user communities can do the certification. This is actually an important part of this, is that we want the customers of these vendors to self-certify, that they can run the same test suite against their OpenStack deployment that the vendor used to certify and test to see if they're getting the right thing or not. And that's one of the ways that we can allow the community to manage its own compliance rather than have the foundation turn into the Interpol of the cloud. If you go and actually look at the Havana score sheet, and I would hope one or two of you out of this crowd do, this is all posted through the wiki, and I'll include links when I post these slides. This is actually my cheat sheet. So this is our first pass through. We don't have a lot of automated tools, so our scoring sheet will show you our score for the criteria. It'll show you the score that each one gets, and then it'll show you the rankings. And then, so I put together a cheat sheet because people are getting a little overwhelmed by the amount of data. And this reiterates what I was saying. We are working on a project called RefStack. I have a couple slides about this that actually collects data. So what we're expecting is that we don't just want you to run the Tempest suite against your own internal cloud. We're expecting that to be part of the process. And then we'll use that data to then inform decisions about the core definition going forward. Okay. So let's look at what this means. We put together 3 examples. Josh picked the name Banana Cloud. I always give him credit on that. And so the idea here is that there's certain things. In green are the required parts, the core parts. So Nova would be a required capability. And remember, this is capabilities. It's not the whole project. So there's capabilities inside of Nova that are core, and there are capabilities inside of Nova that aren't. So there might be advanced features or a new API that you can't count on yet because it's not stable, that doesn't mean that that parts of Nova aren't still required. And this allows us to have a much faster innovation cycle. It allows the projects to keep growing and maturing. And so what we're saying is Nova would have designated code. It would have required capabilities. Keystone, the example I gave before, doesn't have, and I have a blog post with actually some more depth and details on these things, and easy enough to find. So Keystone doesn't have shared code from implementations, right? We're very focused on vendors here. So Rackspace has been widely known to have re-implemented Keystone internally. And so the idea here is that they can do that. It's okay. But they have to be able to pass all the certification tests to make that work. And so this allows us to have some vendors who implement things and change it. Now, it could be that we want Keystone to improve over time so that a company that's re-implemented it could and should start using the shared code and upstream it. That same action to re-implement Keystone effectively made it where all of those contributions were not being shared back with the community. So those improvements weren't being enjoyed by the broader community. And so our expectation is there will be projects that add designated sections, even if they don't have them now. And so there's a lot of knobs to turn in this. And then on the other side, we have projects that wouldn't have required capabilities, but they might have designated code. That doesn't make them core. Just because you have designated code doesn't make you core. You have to have the capability and the code. And you might have projects that are up and coming that don't even have required capabilities or tests. But they're still OpenStack projects, and vendors are encouraged to include them and run them and things like that. And that's actually what allows us to collect the usage data so that we can then become core. So if vendors don't choose to run projects like Trove, we will never, they'll have trouble making it into core because they won't see the adoption. So there's a little bit of a pump priming process with this. All right. And then there's other examples of private cloud. So somebody who's packaged OpenStack, sells it as distribution or as a managed solution. And so the idea here is that in this case, they still have implemented Nova. Nova's pretty straightforward from this perspective. But in this example, that vendor has chosen to implement Ceph instead of Swift. They put Swift APIs on it, so it passes the capabilities test, but they didn't implement any of the Swift code. And one of the things we're actually working through right now on the committee is how does that end up being scored? And so we have two things we can work with. If there's tests, and right now I'll tell you our Havana tests show that there are certain capabilities in Swift that we think are core capabilities, but we have vendors who've implemented solutions that don't use the Swift code. So the board is in the process of reviewing those decisions and actually coming up with, does Swift have designated sections for Havana? And will it have designated sections for Icehouse and Juno? And so those are reflected based on actual use and implementations in the field and in what we think is the right approach to keeping OpenStack growing and healthy and people contributing to the upstreams. This is exactly the type of difficult question that the process is designed to work through. And then once again, we have some other examples like Heat and Hyper-V, both of which, if companies are using them, they're actually effectively generating karma. They're helping OpenStack become a more full-featured cloud and possibly creating features that will become core. And then the third example we have is an API client. So the idea here is that if it's an API client, it's not using OpenStack code. It's using the APIs exclusively. Those clients, those parts of the ecosystem care very much about what is the stable APIs they can depend on, the core APIs and capabilities. So we need to hear from those clients and have them be part of the discussion so that as we evaluate the APIs, there's actually a scoring column for them, that their input is considered in whether or not an API is required or not. The other thing we expect is that this will help drive them to add tests that help validate the things that their libraries or products depend on, right? So this is very empowering. If I was a cloud orchestration system that depended on OpenStack. The poster child for this has been RightScale, although there are many others in the market. But I would care that the APIs performed in the way I expected them to. And we're creating a lot of incentive for a person in the company in the ecosystem who depends on the APIs working a certain way to write tests and make them part of the test suite and do it. And our expectation is that people don't only run the must-pass tests, that they run the whole suite of tests, and we'll collect the ones that pass so that we can actually get a feel for how much of the API is really being used in the field and what things are important. So there's a lot of need for this third case and active participation in the community. Cool. So I'm not going to go too long into this. This is a project that's in very active development right now. It's called RefStack. It may take on another name as it continues to move under OpenStack infra management and become part of the OpenStack web suite of web properties, I guess you would say it. And so the idea here is that RefStack provides a way for people to upload their Tempest results. So when you go and run your cloud, whether it's a qualification run or a vendor or an individual user, you can actually upload the results. And then we will compare them. And then that'll help us conform compliance and see which APIs are trending for capabilities. And so this is part of this long-term process management where we can actually collect real data to show which clouds are interoperable with what. And so we have an expectation that you will be able, I don't know if we're going to make it in time for Juno, but coming in time, you'd actually be able to compare OpenStack products and clouds and your own internal OpenStack clouds and see how they did against other ones and see which APIs you're passing and which ones you're not. And that would actually allow you to make much more informed interoperability decisions about OpenStack. Good. So I'm going to come back to exactly where I started. So this is a community-driven process. Right? The purpose of standing in front of you is to get everybody involved, to help them understand why we're defining core like this, how we're working through the process. Right? We don't have a benevolent dictator in OpenStack. So we need community processes, we need community input, and we want to make our decisions in a principled, data-driven way. The only way that works is if we have voices coming in to support that. Right? If we have data from people running their clouds, it doesn't mean that we have to have shouting matches and everybody needs to play an active part and start coming to DefCore meetings. But what it does mean is that as we roll through this process, people need to understand what's going on. They need to say, hey, I really need these APIs, and if there's APIs or capabilities or designated code sections that you feel passionately should be in or should be out, then those you need to be prepared to talk about that, or to proxy through whatever vendors you're using to talk about that. Because if we don't hear anything, then we're going to make your voice is not going to be part of that conversation. And in those cases, it can be loudest voice wins, which we really want to avoid. So if you like what you're seeing and you think, what I hear from most people, move faster. Why is it taking 18 months? Why is it taking all these cycles to get through a core definition? What's making this take so long when most people I talk to, it's easy, core is this, this, and this. If everybody agreed to the this, and this, it would be great. Half the people say this and that and this other thing. So what we really have to do is have people say, I believe in this, this makes sense to me, I like the process. Plus ones, right, actually contribute to accelerating the process. When we have presentations or meetings and we hear nothing at all, we always slow down the process. We make sure we have community engagement. So if things look good to you, it's just as I love negative feedback too. I truly do. People who know me actually know that we've changed this process significantly based on concerns and issues raised. But if you're like, oh, okay, this is great, and you just walk out of the room and you don't actually give us a thumbs up at some point, it slows down. It actually slows down the implementation, and you might be hurting the actual progress forward on things like that. So more information and links. Once again, I'm happy for one-on-one interactions. My name is Rob Hirschfeld. On Twitter, I'm Zehicle. And I have thousands of words of background and history and comments across my blog under DefCore. There's a lot of things on the wiki. The board tomorrow is going to meet and approve the advisory Havana capabilities. So look for this to continue. So I appreciate your time. Thank you all very much.